It is my pleasure today to welcome our speaker to share her expertise and knowledge about current available PH drugs and new drugs in development. Dr. Anna Hemnes is an associate professor of pulmonary and critical care medicine and the assistant director of the Pulmonary Vascular Center at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Dr. Hemnes, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Jill, for that kind introduction. And it's really an honor to be speaking before this audience today in this virtual format. So I'm going to be talking about drug discovery and development today. And the first question is, what is drug development and discovery? Well, it's the process of discovering and testing a possible new drug and bringing it from the laboratory to patients. The goal of this entire process is to bring new therapies to patients that are both safe for the patients to take and also effective for patients in the disease that it's meant to be treating. There's all kinds of people who care about this, and we call them stakeholders, and they include scientists, people in the pharmaceutical industries, the FDA, and of course, patients. And everybody has their own important role to play and has their own interest in the drug development and discovery. So it makes it a very complex process, and it's time consuming and it's costly and somewhat hard to understand. So I'm hopeful that we'll debunk some of this today for you. So this is an overview of the drug discovery pipeline. The first step is just discovery of the compound itself. So most of the time, this shows sort of the average experience of bringing a drug to market in this figure. And most of the time you have to screen at least 10,000, if not even more compounds to see if they may be effective in animal models or in cell culture or other what we call preclinical models of diseases. And these studies can take a very long time. Here it's shown on average taking about 6.5 years, but certainly some are even longer, depending on the model system and how fast it can be studied. And then of those 10,000 or more compounds that are initially screened, and then on average about 250 compounds will make it through preclinical testing. Ultimately, only about 5 compounds of those initial 10,000 will make it to clinical studies to ultimately produce 1 compound. And these clinical studies take on average 6 years. We're going to go through a little bit in a minute the phases of studies that occur in these clinical tests. But suffice to say, they take a long time. So by the time that this is all done, you can see in the bottom, there's about 14 or 15 years that can occur to bring a drug actually to a consumer from its initial study in the lab. And so in the clinical phase of testing, we talk about 3 main phases. The first is phase 1, in which a drug is tested for the first time in people. And the goal of this is to see if the drug is even safe at all in people. The second phase is phase 2, and it includes patients, whereas phase 1, for the most part, is focused on healthy volunteers. Phase 2 includes patients and tests for safety and efficacy. And efficacy may not be, it may be, for instance, in pulmonary hypertension, it may be markers of efficacy based on right heart catheterization data, as opposed to what is usually used for pivotal trials like 6-minute walk test. So it's a smaller study than would be normally a phase 3 study, and is still, again, looking for safety in that specific disease population and whether there may be any signal for efficacy in that specific disease population. And if a drug looks promising at the phase 2 level rather, then the next step is to do a phase 3 trial. And usually this is a much larger group of patients that would be included in phase 2, because at this point you think the drug is likely to be safe and you feel confident in exposing more patients to the drug. This phase 3 trial will compare usually the new compound with standard of care, and it further tests in a larger population safety and efficacy. Now, the critical thing is that the drug needs to be efficacious. So it has to actually work to improve the disease to pass this final phase 3 process. once drugs have passed this phase 3 process and have been able to show safety and efficacy, then they can be approved by FDA review, which is what happens in the United States. And then the drug can come to consumers. And then frequently, we will perform what's called phase 4 studies, where patients are enrolled either in new indications of the drug rather, or observational studies to see what happens long-term with drug exposure. And these are designed to show the long-term safety and benefit of this compound in this disease specifically. So these are the general phases of drug discovery. And you can imagine this is really time-consuming and takes a lot of expense and time, like I mentioned. So what are the kinds of questions that one can answer through clinical trials? Well, probably the most important thing to answer, and the first question, is the drug safe in humans? Because we don't want to give a drug and harm people. So we need to really be careful and define what are the benefits and risks of drug exposure. So the first is it safe, and can we tolerate whatever side effects or potential downsides might occur after administration of the drug? So if the drug's safe, that's great, but nobody wants to take a pill every day that does nothing for them. So the next question is, how effective is this drug? And does the drug improve the disease of interest? And each disease will have a specific measure of that improvement. Frequently, in pulmonary arterial hypertension specifically, studies will look for efficacy using 6-minute walk distance. So the patient could walk further after drug exposure than they could before drug exposure. But sometimes we also look at staying out of the hospital and surviving longer, or not having to escalate from oral therapy for PAH to parenteral, things like IV and subcutaneous medications. Other questions that can be answered through clinical trials is like, what's the best method to deliver the drug? Is it oral? Is it inhaled? Is it IV? And what dose is best? So a lot of trials will have 2 different doses of drug. And lastly, a couple of other questions we ask is, does the drug compare to current standard of care? This is particularly important in pulmonary hypertension trials. You have to define what the current standard of care is and then see if the drug is beneficial compared to that. And then we do start asking ourselves which patients will benefit from this medication, and are there a specific group of patients who derive a benefit from this, and a specific group of patients who do not, who therefore shouldn't be exposed to this drug. So these are kind of questions. So the goal of drug discovery and development is to bring new treatments to patients that are safe and effective. And like I mentioned in the last slide, the process is really complex, it's time consuming, and it's extraordinarily expensive, unfortunately. So let's talk about how pulmonary arterial hypertension impacts blood flow. This slide is a really nice slide of what we think of as the pathology in the pulmonary arteries of patients with pulmonary arterial hypertension and how they compare to normal. So on the far left, you can see a healthy pulmonary artery, and you can see that there's names to the things that are in the wall of this pulmonary artery. It's like as if it was sliced down the middle. There's the adventitia, the media, and the intima. And you can see this in cross-section down below. And in a normal pulmonary artery, they're healthy, they're flexible, and blood flows easily without any restriction or resistance through this pulmonary artery. In panel B, which is just to the right of that, in mild pulmonary arterial hypertension, the artery, you can see that the wall of the artery is getting thicker than it was in a healthy pulmonary artery. And it limits blood flow and increases resistance, but there is still blood able to get through. When we look at C, moderate pulmonary arterial hypertension, you can see blood flow is restricted, the wall is even thicker than it was before, and you can see in the cross-sectional view in the bottom that it's harder for cells to get through there, and it creates a lot of resistance. And then D is described as severe pulmonary arterial hypertension with plexiform lesions. And plexiform lesions is this sort of outgrowth looking thing that's in the artery at the bottom. And it is really a hallmark of severe pulmonary arterial hypertension. Oftentimes there's blood clots in there because the blood can't flow normally through there. And we think the plexiform lesion may perhaps be some way of the body's attempt to open up that artery and improve flow. And so this is the pathology that we are really trying to reverse in treating pulmonary arterial hypertension. So let's talk about the many pathways that regulate pulmonary hypertension disease progression. This is an area of active research all over the world, and people are trying to understand which pathways should be targeted. There are several that have been described thus far, but suffice it to say that if I gave this talk in 5 years, we might come up with some other ones that are not here. So prostacyclin opens blood vessels and helps them widen and relax. Nitric oxide, this is a very potent signaling molecule that has a very short half-life, and it signals blood vessels to relax, like I said. Endothelin is signaling blood vessels to tighten up when it's high particularly, and also to constrict, so that it signals the muscles to essentially flex. Angiogenesis, so this is talking about stimuli that make new blood vessel growth and can be important in pulmonary arterial hypertension. Growth factors are things that regulate cell growth and enhance or tell cells to turn over more frequently or divide more commonly. Inflammation is things that promote an immune response, like recruiting white blood cells to come to an area and fight off an infection, or in this case, just to come to the blood cell. Neurohormonal activation includes signaling for blood vessels to relax or constrict, and can regulate blood pressure in the body, in the rest of the body, not just the pulmonary artery. Cellular metabolism is really important in pulmonary hypertension. It's how energy is generated for cells, and is definitely altered in pulmonary hypertension. Extracellular matrix is talking about the parts of the vessel wall that are remodeled and cause them to be tight and stiff. BMPR2 signaling is really critical to pulmonary arterial hypertension. It is known that patients with heritable PAH frequently have mutations in BMPR2, which is a gene. And also the signaling in this pathway is altered in almost all forms of pulmonary arterial hypertension, and it regulates vascular remodeling and is an area of intense study. Calcium signaling regulates blood pressure and also tone of the blood vessel, so it regulates how tight the muscle cells around the blood vessel are constricting. So the pathways that are currently targeted by PAH drugs include the three that you see here: prostacyclin, endothelin, and nitric oxide. So nitric oxide we'll talk about first. There are therapies that address this. It's clear in pulmonary arterial hypertension that there is too little nitric oxide present in the blood vessel. And what nitric oxide does is dilate and open blood vessels in the lungs. We call it a vasodilator. And there are medications that increase nitric oxide that are FDA approved for pulmonary arterial hypertension. And these include PDE5 inhibitors or soluble guanylate cyclase stimulators. And you may know these by the names tadalafil, sildenafil, or riociguat, and you can see the brand names to the right. Another common problem in pulmonary arterial hypertension is that there's not enough prostacyclin. And so that's led to drugs that target this prostacyclin pathway. And prostacyclin dilates and opens blood vessels. We call it a vasodilator also. Medications that target this pathway and increase it include prostacyclin analogs, including treprostinil that can be oral, subcutaneous, IV, or inhaled. Selexipag, which is an oral prostacyclin receptor agonist. iloprost, which is an inhaled form of prostacyclin, and epoprostenol, which is an intravenous form of prostacyclin. And then lastly, we have found that patients with pulmonary arterial hypertension have too much endothelin present. And endothelin is a very potent message to blood vessels to constrict. And so what these drugs do is essentially try to block that signal, and they reduce the effects of endothelin. We call these endothelin receptor antagonists. And you can see there's 3 that are approved: macitentan, bosentan, and ambrisentan. The current PAH therapies, I mentioned this a little bit on the last slide, can be delivered in several different ways. So there are oral treatment options. These include all the endothelin receptor antagonists: ambrisentan, bosentan, and macitentan. They also include all the phosphodiesterase type 5 inhibitors, sildenafil and tadalafil. And then there's now prostacyclin analogs that are available orally, including oral treprostinil or selective IP receptor stimulators, again targeting the prostacyclin pathway, including selexipag. And then in the nitric oxide pathway, our soluble guanylate cyclase stimulator, riociguat. There's inhaled options for treating pulmonary arterial hypertension. And these are both in the prostacyclin pathway, and they include iloprost and inhaled treprostinil. Subcutaneous treatment options are the prostacyclin analog treprostinil, and then IV treatment options are 2 forms of epoprostenol: the old-fashioned Flolan, and then the room temperature stable kind that goes by the brand name Veletri. And then there's also intravenous treprostinil. So that's what we have presently in our toolkit for treating pulmonary arterial hypertension. But we recognize that we need to continue with drug development and discovery in order to find more effective therapies. And so there are many clinical trials presently underway for pulmonary hypertension. In fact, there's 48 phase 2 trials and 26 phase 3 clinical trials in progress. And this is not a surprising ratio, because as we showed on the earlier slide, many trials, many compounds don't make it out of phase 2 trials because they don't appear to be safe or effective in the disease of interest. So there's always going to be more phase 2 trials than there are phase 3 trials. And the present studies are targeting endothelin, prostacyclin, and nitric oxide pathways. And they're looking for safety, efficacy, and dosing, long-term treatment, combination studies, and pediatric studies. So they're using drugs that we already know, but trying to understand them in different populations that we have not previously studied, or that we don't really know, like how long treatment with a specific combination of medications may be useful, or could these drugs have utility in treating pediatric pulmonary hypertension. So let's talk about some clinical trials that are underway that are addressing new pathways. So there's new biology processes that are under investigation. So we talked about several different pathways on our pathways of pulmonary hypertension slide, and as I'm sure you saw, many of them were not, in fact, addressed by the present drugs that we have. So inflammation is one of those. Cellular metabolism is another. Growth factors, BMPR2 signaling, neuropeptide signaling, angiogenesis. So all of these are presently under investigation in clinical trials for pulmonary hypertension. And then the other important area of research right now is studies in patients with pulmonary hypertension for that is not pulmonary arterial hypertension. So folks that have COPD and pulmonary hypertension, or significant interstitial lung disease, perhaps from scleroderma and pulmonary hypertension. Sarcoidosis and idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis is also an important area of research with associated pulmonary hypertension. So you can see on this slide, although the top 3, prostacyclin, endothelin, and nitric oxide, have and are presently addressed by our current FDA-approved drugs, there's all these other pathways that have yet to be addressed and offer hope for new therapies that may offer more benefit or more efficacy in treating pulmonary hypertension. Now we're going to talk about sort of challenges in PH drug development. So there are real challenges in the drug development for pulmonary hypertension. So the first issue that comes up really commonly is that there's going to be limitations to clinical trial enrollment because the population is small. And of course, PAH in particular is an orphan disease. So there's a limited number of folks that can enroll in these trials. One of the major solutions that we're using now as a community is newer clinical trial designs and adaptive designs to address this so that we can really take advantage of people that can and are willing to participate in research to make the most of their contribution to the clinical trial. The second is that better clinical trial tests are needed. And to sort of clarify this, we need new outcomes, for instance, or things that we can detect response to therapy. So we're hoping to just define in a shorter term if a drug is working in patients so that patients don't have to be in a trial for years and years and years. They could be in a trial for a shorter period of time. And these clinical tests might be better measures of improvement in the pulmonary vascular changes that I showed you earlier. It could be changes in a biomarker that's in the blood or something like that, but that's an active area of research. We'd like to have studies that are more predictive in animal models so that we don't have to perform a number of phase 1 and 2 clinical trials in particular in drugs that are unlikely to be effective in humans. And so we're working in partnership with basic research and patients who are donating various tissues and blood, et cetera, to have a better preclinical models of disease. And we really need an improved understanding of pulmonary hypertension biology to target new biologic processes for drug discovery. And this really is where we're trying to advance pulmonary hypertension research and learn more about pulmonary hypertension biology. So understanding really basic mechanisms of how disease starts in people to see if we could impact that, or understanding how we can make disease better using novel pathways. And these really are sort of some of the most basic experiments and research that we do involving the best preclinical models that we can. So you might be sitting there saying, gosh, this sounds really important. I would like to participate. And here are some ways that you might consider participating in drug development. The first thing to know is that patients are really crucial for drug discovery and development success. Without patients, we cannot know if drugs are helping in that population. So I, as a researcher and as somebody who cares for patients with pulmonary hypertension, am so appreciative of all the patients that I have taken care of over the years who have donated their time and participated in these trials, accepted the risk that's involved in that. I think it is really a tremendous gift to give to all the future people who may unfortunately suffer with this disease. There are a couple of ways that you can participate in research. One is you might be interested in participating in clinical trials. So these are like trials of drugs in humans to see if the drug might work. And probably the best way to see if this is available to you is to talk to your healthcare team and see if they're offering any studies and if they might be right for you. You can also look at an online tool here. You can see the website that the PHA runs. It is a clinical trial finder. You can look at some of the registries of clinical trials also. So if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, which is shown here, you can search pulmonary hypertension and see what trials come up, and the inclusion and exclusion criteria are posted there. And then if you're interested in learning more about pulmonary hypertension research and clinical trials, there's some really nice PHA classroom videos, and the link is shown right there. And I think that would be a really great place to start to learn about what's involved in research. I think it's also important to recognize, though, that not all pulmonary hypertension research is drug trials. There are people, myself included, who actively use, for instance, blood samples or tissue samples to study pulmonary hypertension and define what causes disease and to try new interventions. So you may be able to qualify for these research studies also. The other option is to enroll in the PHA patient registry, which helps us understand what happens to patients across their journey in pulmonary hypertension. So there's many ways that you can participate in research that are not just simply clinical trials. So if clinical trials, you're not eligible for them, or you're don't feel comfortable with that, then there are still mechanisms for you to participate in this. And for folks that are family members and caregivers out there, a lot of times healthy volunteers are necessary for either phase 1 trials or as comparators for the blood and tissue-based studies. So you too can participate, and you might be able to talk to the PH clinical team about how that, if that's available to you. So to talk again about the pipeline that we have here, you can see that there were so many thousands of compounds that were screened. Only 250 really looked like they might, or were made it to preclinical models like in rodent models. About 5 compounds made it to clinical trials, and then only 1 per that 10,000 made it to FDA review. The drugs that we presently have are targeting the nitric oxide, prostacyclin, and endothelin pathways. But there's a number of drugs that are in clinical development that you could see on the previous slide. And I think now will be time for us to move ahead.